Welcome back to the channel, dear listeners. Tonight, we step once more into a world of quiet villages, old secrets, and the kind of mystery that unravels not with a shout, but with a whisper. Settle in, pour your tea, and let the story carry you away. There are villages that keep their secrets buried deep, and there are villages that simply forget to ask questions. Thornbury Hollow was neither. It was the sort of place where secrets were known to everyone and spoken of by no one, tucked behind polite smiles, tea trays, and a low hum of gossip that never quite rose to the surface. It sat in a fold of the Cotswold Hills, half forgotten by the main road, its cottages leaning companionably toward one another, as though sharing a joke too old to remember the punchline of. Chapter 1. The sound that woke the village. Agnes Pemberton had lived in Thornbury Hollow for 61 years, and in all that time she had learned one truth above all others. The village slept lightly. It was not a place of deep, untroubled rest. It dozed the way an old cat dozes, one eye closed, one ear tuned to the smallest disturbance. So when the bell of St. Aldhelm's began to toll at midnight, half the village was awake within minutes, and the other half within the hour. Agnes herself had not been asleep. She rarely was, these days. Sleep had become a stranger to her since her retirement 3 years past, as though the 40 years of rising at 6:30 for a classroom of restless children had worn a groove into her body that peace alone could not smooth over. She sat by her window most nights with a book she wasn't reading and a cup of tea gone lukewarm, watching the dark press against the glass. She had heard the first toll and thought, absurdly, of Mrs. Halloway's cat, which had a habit of knocking things over in the vicarage garden. But no cat could produce that sound, deep, resonant, deliberate. A sound with weight behind it, a sound that meant something. She counted. 12 tolls, evenly spaced, unhurried. The bell of a funeral, not an alarm. By the time she had pulled on her coat and stepped into the lane, lights were blooming in windows up and down Thornbury Hollow like a slow-spreading rash. Old Tom Ashcombe stood in his doorway in his nightshirt, squinting toward the church. The Bellamy children's faces were pressed to their nursery window, more thrilled than frightened. Somewhere, a dog was barking itself hoarse. Miss Pemberton! It was young Constable Reeves, jogging up the lane with his torch swinging wildly, the beam catching hedgerows and startled faces in turn. He'd been a pupil of hers once, a boy who couldn't sit still, who was now, she noted with some private amusement, still unable to walk in a straight line. "Did you hear it too?" "The whole village heard it, Peter," she said, using his Christian name out of old habit, though he wore a uniform now, and carried himself with a seriousness that didn't quite fit him yet, like a coat bought a size too large in hopes of growing into it. "Has anyone been up to the tower?" "Vicar Ainsley's gone up now. I'm headed there myself." He hesitated, and something in his hesitation made Agnes's stomach tighten. "Will you come, Miss Pemberton? You've a way of noticing things." It was not, strictly speaking, a policeman's job to invite a retired schoolteacher to a crime scene, if crime scene it was. But Thornbury Hollow had never quite recovered from the affair of the poisoned marmalade 2 summers past, when it was Agnes who had noticed that Mrs. Culpepper's handwriting on the jam labels didn't match the handwriting in her recipe book, and unravelled a small, sad tragedy of jealousy and inheritance before the county police had so much as finished their tea. Since then, the village had developed a quiet, unspoken habit of fetching Agnes Pemberton when something didn't sit right. She walked with Peter Reeves up the lane toward the church, her breath fogging faintly in the cool August night. For even in high summer, Thornbury Hollow's nights carried a chill that crept up from the river. The bonfire from the Lammas celebrations still smouldered on the green, its embers glowing like a dying eye in the dark, and the smell of wood smoke clung to everything, mixing uneasily now with something else, something colder. The churchyard gate stood open. It was never locked, there had never been reason to lock it, but tonight its openness felt like an invitation extended by someone who knew exactly who would come through it. Vicar Ainsley was standing near the old yew tree, his lantern raised, his face the colour of chalk. He was a young man, new to the parish only this spring, still unused to the particular weight of a village's unspoken expectations. When he turned toward them, Agnes saw that his hand was shaking. "I went up to the bell tower first," he said, his voice thin. "The rope was still, no one there. I thought, I don't know what I thought. A prank, perhaps. Boys from the Hendricks farm, or... He stopped. And then, Agnes prompted gently, and then I came down, and I saw... He gestured, unable to finish, toward the base of the U. Agnes stepped forward, Peter's torch beam guiding her feet across the uneven ground, past headstones softened by centuries of moss, names worn to little more than suggestions. And there, in the hollow between two of the oldest graves, the Thornbury family plot, if she recalled correctly, dating back to the village's founding families, lay a woman's shawl, pale blue, edged with a delicate hand-stitched pattern of wheat sheaves, entirely unremarkable, except for one detail that made Agnes's breath catch. It was soaked through with blood. There was no body. That was the strange and terrible thing of it. No body, no obvious wound to explain such a quantity of blood. Nothing but the shawl itself, folded with an odd, deliberate neatness, as though someone had taken care even in the midst of violence, as though the placing of it mattered as much as the blood upon it. "Don't touch it," Agnes said quietly, when Peter Reeves took an instinctive step forward. "Not yet. Look first. Always look before you touch." It was something she had told her pupils 1,000 times, over spelling errors and broken pencils and childish quarrels, never dreaming she would one day say it over a bloodied shawl in a moonlit churchyard. She crouched, her knees protesting, 61 years pressing down on her all at once, and studied the shawl without laying a finger on it. The pattern was familiar. She had seen it before, and recently. Her mind, trained by decades of noticing small things in a room full of children, began sorting through faces, through afternoons at the village hall, through the quiet parade of Thornbury Hollow's daily life. "Miss Pemberton?" Peter's voice, uncertain, young again despite the uniform. "I know this shawl," Agnes said slowly, and felt the words settle into her like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not yet see the end of. "I saw Eleanor Whitfield wearing it not 3 days ago, at the harvest fete." The name hung in the cold night air, and somewhere behind them, in the darkness beyond the churchyard wall, a twig snapped, soft, deliberate, and utterly unmistakable. Someone was watching them. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Wasn't There. The sound did not come again. Peter Reeves swung his torch toward the churchyard wall, the beam catching nothing but the black shapes of hawthorn bushes stirring faintly in the breeze. He took a step toward the wall, hand instinctively going to his belt, as though he expected to find something more useful there than a notebook and a whistle. "Leave it," Agnes said, and there was something in her voice, not fear, but the particular firmness of a woman who had spent 40 years preventing children from running headlong into trouble, that made him stop. "Whoever it was is gone now, or gone to ground. Chasing shadows in a churchyard at midnight will only mean 2 of us stumbling over graves instead of 1. Vicar Ainsley, still pale, still gripping his lantern as though it were the only solid thing left in the world, found his voice at last. "Eleanor Whitfield," he repeated. "You're certain. As certain as one can be about a shawl seen across a crowded fete." Agnes rose slowly, brushing grass from her skirt, her eyes still fixed on the blue fabric with its careful, terrible folding. "But I don't think we should waste the rest of the night confirming it in the dark. Peter, I think it's time you telephoned the station at Chipping Norton. This is rather beyond a village constable's Sunday night duties, however capable that constable might be." Peter flushed slightly at what might have been either compliment or criticism, and hurried off toward the vicarage, where the nearest telephone sat in Vicar Ainsley's study. That left Agnes alone with the young vicar, the yew tree, and the shawl neither of them dared touch. "You knew her then?" Ainsley asked. "Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone in Thornbury Hollow knows everyone," Agnes said, which is rather the trouble with villages, and rather their charm too, depending on the week. "Eleanor kept, I suppose I ought not to assume, the little haberdashery on Mill Lane. Quiet woman, widowed young, kept mostly to herself, though she was pleasant enough when spoken to, made that shawl herself if I'm not mistaken. She was clever with a needle. You don't think she's—" Ainsley couldn't finish the thought, and Agnes did not blame him for it. Death was easier to discuss in the abstract than to name directly, especially for a young vicar not yet hardened to the business of burying his parishioners. "I don't know what I think yet," Agnes said honestly. That's rather the trouble with thinking before one has enough to think with. But I'll tell you what strikes me as odd, Vicar, if you'll indulge an old woman's habits. She gestured toward the shawl without touching it. There's blood enough here to suggest a serious injury, and yet no body. No drag marks in the grass that I can see, though we'll want proper light for that come morning. No sign of a struggle beyond the shawl itself. And the bell rang at midnight precisely, 12 slow tolls, as deliberately as any bell ringer I've ever heard. And yet you found no one in the tower. A ghost, Ainsley said, with the ghost of a smile that suggested he didn't quite believe it himself, but wanted, perhaps, for a moment, the comfort of pretending he might. Village bells don't ring themselves, Vicar. Whatever comfort there might be in believing otherwise, someone rang that bell. And I think, Agnes said slowly, turning the thought over as she spoke it, testing its weight, I think whoever rang it wanted the whole village woken, wanted us all out of our beds and into the lane, looking toward the church, at precisely the moment this shawl was being left here for us to find. Why would anyone want that? It was, Agnes reflected, exactly the right question, and she did not yet have an answer for it. Perhaps, she said, because the truth of what happened tonight is only half the story. Perhaps the other half is happening somewhere else in the village, at the very same moment, somewhere that wanted every pair of eyes turned away from it and toward this churchyard instead. The thought settled uncomfortably into the cold night air, and Ainsley shivered, though whether from cold or unease, Agnes couldn't say. They did not have long to wait before Constable Reeves returned, slightly out of breath, with news that the county police would arrive by morning, Chipping Norton being some distance, and the roads at night being what they were. In the meantime, he had been instructed to secure the scene and speak to no one until a proper detective arrived. Which means, Agnes said, with the faint dryness of a woman who had spent her career working around rules rather than against them, that you're not to conduct an investigation, Peter, but I don't recall anyone telling an old schoolteacher not to walk down to Mill Lane and check that a shopkeeper is safely asleep in her bed. Peter opened his mouth to object, then closed it again, because he had known Agnes Pemberton since he was 7 years old and understood, with the particular wisdom of former pupils everywhere, that objecting rarely accomplished anything. I'll come with you, he said instead, just to be sure. Mill Lane was a short walk from the church, past the shuttered post office and the war memorial, with its list of names Agnes had known personally, half a lifetime ago. Eleanor Whitfield's haberdashery sat at the lane's end, a narrow building with a bow window that in daylight displayed spools of ribbon and carefully arranged buttons, but which now showed only darkness. Agnes knocked. No answer came. She knocked again, more firmly, and pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sound of movement within. Footsteps, a voice, the creak of a floorboard. Nothing. The curtains, Peter said suddenly, nodding toward the upstairs window, where Eleanor Whitfield kept her small flat above the shop. They're open. She always keeps them drawn at night. My mother's mentioned it, says Eleanor's private that way. Agnes looked up at the dark square of open window and felt the cold settle deeper into her bones. Not from the night air this time, but from something closer to certainty. Peter, she said quietly, I think we'd best find a way inside. He hesitated only a moment before trying the door handle. It turned easily beneath his hand, unlocked, in a village where doors were so rarely locked that the absence of a bolt meant nothing on its own, and yet, tonight, meant everything. The shop was empty. The little flat above it, when they climbed the narrow stairs, torch beam trembling slightly in Peter's grip, was empty too, the bed made, undisturbed, as though no one had slept in it at all that night. Eleanor Whitfield was nowhere to be found. Chapter 3. What the Morning Revealed. By the time the sun rose over Thornbury Hollow, gilding the church tower and burning the last of the mist off the water meadows, the village had transformed into something Agnes Pemberton scarcely recognised, a place of hushed doorstep conversations, curtains twitching not from curiosity alone, but from something closer to fear, and a steady trickle of villagers making their way, with studied casualness, past the churchyard gate to see for themselves what all the fuss had been about. Detective Inspector Halloran arrived from Chipping Norton a little after 7, a broad, weathered man with the sort of patient, unhurried manner that Agnes recognised immediately as belonging to someone who had learned, the hard way, that village mysteries rewarded slowness far more than they rewarded speed. He listened to Constable Reeves's account with a steady nod, glanced once at Agnes with the particular assessing look of a man deciding whether an elderly woman was an asset or an obstacle, and, to his credit, Agnes thought, arrived quickly at the correct conclusion. "You found the shawl," he said, "and you're the one who identified it." "I am," Agnes said. "Agnes Pemberton. I taught school here for 40 years, Inspector, which means there is very little in Thornbury Hollow I haven't seen at least once, including, I imagine, whatever brought us all to this churchyard last night." Halloran's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I've heard your name before, Miss Pemberton. The Culpeper business, 2 summers back. You have good sources. I have a sergeant who grew up 3 villages over and never stops talking about it." He turned back to the shawl, now photographed and carefully bagged by a young constable who had arrived with him, and crouched to examine the ground where it had lain. "Tell me what you noticed. Everything. Don't worry about sounding foolish. Foolish notions have solved more cases than clever ones, in my experience." It was, Agnes reflected, an unusually generous invitation from a man she'd known less than 10 minutes, and she found herself warming to Inspector Halloran despite herself. "The shawl was folded," she said. "Not dropped, not flung aside in a struggle. Folded, with the corners matched. The way one folds laundry rather than the way one loses a garment in a fight. That struck me as wrong from the first moment I saw it. A woman fleeing for her life does not pause to fold her shawl neatly before leaving it behind. Unless someone else did the folding," Halloran said slowly, following the thought. "Precisely. And there's the matter of the blood itself." Agnes gestured to the stained grass beneath where the shawl had lain. "Soaked through the fabric, yes, but very little on the ground beneath it, as though the shawl absorbed the blood elsewhere and was only afterward brought here and arranged. If Eleanor Whitfield was injured in this churchyard, Inspector, I'd expect considerably more evidence of it in the grass and the stones round about. I see none." Halloran looked at her for a long moment, then rose, brushing dirt from his knees. "You're suggesting the scene was staged." "I'm suggesting," Agnes said carefully, "that someone wanted this churchyard found exactly as we found it, and wanted the whole village woken to witness the finding. The bell wasn't an accident, Inspector, and I don't believe this shawl was left here by accident either. Someone built this scene the way a person builds an alibi, carefully and with an audience in mind. The search of Eleanor Whitfield's shop and flat, conducted properly now in the grey light of morning, yielded little that Agnes hadn't already gathered from her nighttime visit with Peter Reeves. The bed unslept in, no sign of struggle, a cup of tea left half-finished on the kitchen table downstairs, gone stone cold, with a faint ring of lipstick on its rim that suggested Eleanor had been interrupted mid-sip rather than fleeing in terror. "She knew whoever came to the door," Halloran said, studying the cup, "or trusted them enough to let them in without alarm. Or it was someone she was expecting," Agnes offered, "which in a village this size narrows the field rather less than you might hope, Inspector. Everyone in Thornbury Hollow expects everyone else, sooner or later." It was in the small back room behind the shop, used, Agnes recalled, as a workroom where Eleanor kept her sewing, that Halloran's constable found something that made Agnes's stomach turn cold in a way the churchyard's blood-soaked shawl had not quite managed. A second shawl, identical in pattern to the first, wheat sheaves stitched in pale thread along pale blue wool, but unfinished, half its border still bare of embroidery, a needle left threaded and abandoned mid-stitch, as though its maker had set it down expecting to return within the hour. "2 shawls," Halloran murmured, turning the unfinished piece over in his hands. "Or 1 shawl and its twin," Agnes said quietly, a thought beginning to take shape in her mind, still too formless to voice aloud with any confidence. "Inspector, might I ask, when your men searched the churchyard properly this morning, in daylight, did they find any sign of footprints beyond Vicar Ainsley's and Constable Reeves's own?" Halloran's expression sharpened with interest. "As it happens, yes. A woman's shoe print, smaller than either man's, pressed into the soft ground near the yew, leading away from the grave plot, toward the churchyard's back wall, where the hawthorn hedge has a gap wide enough for someone slight to pass through." Leading away, Agnes repeated softly. Not toward. You think she walked out of that churchyard under her own power? I think, Agnes said, choosing her words with the particular care she reserved, for moments when a half-formed theory threatened to run ahead of the evidence supporting it, that we have been assuming, from the very first toll of that bell, that we were searching for a victim. I wonder now, Inspector, whether we ought to be searching instead for a woman who left that shawl behind quite deliberately, and who very much wanted us to believe something happened to her here last night, when in fact, she simply wanted the whole of Thornbury Hollow looking the wrong way. Halloran was quiet for a long moment, turning the unfinished shawl over once more in his hands. Looking the wrong way from what, Miss Pemberton? Agnes looked past him, toward the workroom's single window, which faced not the church, not the lane, but the low stone wall separating Eleanor Whitfield's garden from the property beyond it. The grand, ivy-covered house belonging to Thornbury Hollow's wealthiest and most private family. That, Inspector, she said slowly, is precisely what I intend to find out. Chapter 4. The House Behind the Wall. The house beyond Eleanor Whitfield's garden was called Thornbury Grange, and it had stood at the edge of the village for longer than anyone living could properly account for. A rambling pile of grey stone and ivy, its windows tall and narrow, its gardens once magnificent and now merely respectable, the way old wealth so often settled into quiet decline, without ever quite admitting to it. It belonged to the Thornbury family, from whom the village had taken its name centuries ago, though little remained now of that founding grandeur beyond the house itself and the family plot in the churchyard where Eleanor's shawl had been found. The current occupant was Cordelia Thornbury, a woman somewhere in her 50s whom Agnes had known. In the distant, formal way, one knows the last remnant of a village's aristocracy, for the better part of 3 decades. Cordelia rarely attended the fete, rarely appeared at church beyond the obligatory Christmas service, and was regarded by most of Thornbury Hollow with the particular mixture of respect and suspicion reserved for families who had once owned everything, and now, visibly, owned rather less. You think Eleanor Whitfield was involved with the Thornburys somehow, Halloran said, as they walked the short distance from the shop to the Grange's iron gates, Peter Reeves trailing a respectful pace behind, with his notebook at the ready. I think it worth asking why a haberdasher's workroom window faces directly onto the garden wall of the wealthiest house in the village, Agnes replied, when every other window in that shop faces the lane, the church, or the fields beyond. Someone chose that workroom's position rather deliberately, Inspector, or someone chose to spend a great many hours in it watching something across that wall. The housekeeper who answered the Grange's heavy front door was a stout, tight-lipped woman named Mrs. Prentice, who informed them, with evident reluctance, that Miss Thornbury was not receiving visitors, before Halloran produced his warrant card, and the reluctance evaporated into something closer to alarm. They found Cordelia Thornbury in a drawing-room that smelled faintly of dust and old roses, seated near a cold fireplace with a shawl of her own draped across her shoulders. Not blue, Agnes noted, but a deep burgundy, though the stitching along its edge bore an unmistakable resemblance to the wheat-sheaf pattern that had haunted the last 12 hours of Agnes's life. Eleanor made that for you, Agnes said, before Halloran had a chance to begin his questioning properly, and watched Cordelia Thornbury's carefully composed face falter, just slightly, at the directness of it. She made a great many things for a great many people, Cordelia said. It's rather her trade, Miss Pemberton. It is, and yet I don't recall seeing you at the fete these past several years to purchase from her stall, nor in her shop, when I've passed it on my walks. And yet you're wearing her work this morning, the very morning she seems to have vanished from her bed, leaving behind a shawl soaked in blood and folded with peculiar care in the churchyard where your family has been buried for 300 years. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Peter Reeves's pencil, hovering above his notebook, seemed almost afraid to move. You'd better sit down, Miss Pemberton, Cordelia said at last, her voice gone quiet and strangely tired, as though some weight she'd carried a long while had finally grown too heavy to bear alone. All of you, I think it's time someone in this village heard the truth, and I'd rather it came from me than from whatever version the gossips will invent by Sunday. What Cordelia Thornbury told them over the course of the next half hour was not the confession of a murder, though it took Agnes some careful listening to be entirely certain of that. Eleanor Whitfield, it transpired, was not merely Thornbury Hollow's haberdasher. She was Cordelia's half-sister, the daughter of old Reginald Thornbury, and a housemaid he had never publicly acknowledged, born on the wrong side of a family divide that had cost her any claim to the Thornbury name or the Thornbury fortune, and left her, upon her mother's early death, to be raised in the village as plain Eleanor Whitfield, with no one but Cordelia herself ever fully aware of the truth. "Our father was not a kind man," Cordelia said, her hands twisting in her lap. "He gave her nothing, not his name, not a shilling of support, nothing but the cottage her mother had lived in, which he considered generosity enough. I was 12 when I learned the truth, and I have spent the better part of 40 years trying, in whatever small ways I could manage, without exposing either of us to scandal, to make some amends for it." "The shawls," Agnes said softly, understanding beginning to dawn. "She made them for you, and you paid her far more than any haberdasher's shawl was worth, and called it patronage rather than what it truly was." "Something like that." Cordelia's eyes were wet now, though she made no move to wipe them, as though the tears were simply another fact to be endured alongside all the others. "But it was never enough, Miss Pemberton. She wanted what our father owed her, not money, not charity dressed up as commerce, but acknowledgement. A place in the family plot when her time came, her name recorded properly, at long last, as a Thornbury." "And last night?" Halloran asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Agnes could see the weight of the question in the tightening of his jaw. "Last night she came to me," Cordelia said, "as she has come to me a dozen times before, over the years, asking the same question, receiving the same answer, that I could not, that the family solicitors would never permit it, that our father's will was quite explicit and quite final. But last night was different. Last night she told me she intended to go to the churchyard herself, at midnight, and ring that bell until the whole village came to see her standing beside our family's graves, and she intended to tell every soul in Thornbury Hollow exactly whose daughter she truly was." The room had gone very still. Even the fire, unlit as it was, seemed to hold its silence along with everyone else's. "She rang the bell herself," Agnes said slowly. "But the blood, Miss Thornbury, the shawl. If this was only ever meant to be a confession, spoken aloud before a gathered village, where does the blood belong in that story?" Cordelia Thornbury looked up at last, and in her eyes Agnes saw not the guilt of a woman confessing to violence, but something far closer to grief. "That," she said quietly, "is the one part of this I cannot yet explain to you, Miss Pemberton, because when I went to that churchyard myself, not 20 minutes after she left this house, I could not find my sister anywhere at all." Chapter 5. The Gap in the Hedge. Inspector Halloran was a man who had learned, over many years and many villages, that the most dangerous moment in any investigation was the moment a story sounded complete, a tidy confession, a shape that fit. These were the very things, in his experience, that had led more than one careless detective astray. So when Cordelia Thornbury finished speaking and sat back in her chair, as though the telling of it had cost her something physical, Halloran did not relax. He leaned forward instead. "You went to the churchyard," he said. "At what time, precisely?" "Not long after midnight I heard the bell. Everyone heard the bell, and I knew at once it was her, though I couldn't have told you how I knew. Some sisters simply know these things, Inspector, however distant the circumstances of their raising." Cordelia's hands had stilled in her lap now, folded with the same deliberate care Agnes had noted in the shawl itself. "I dressed as quickly as I could, and went out through the garden gate, the one that leads directly to the lane behind Eleanor's shop, and up toward the church. By the time I arrived, the bell had gone silent, and there was no one in the churchyard at all. No Eleanor, no shawl, not yet at least, though it must have been there already in the dark, and I simply failed to see it in my haste." "You didn't call out for her? Search more thoroughly?" "I called her name a dozen times," Cordelia said, and for the first time her composure cracked properly, a tremor entering her voice that Agnes suspected had been suppressed, with considerable effort, since the moment they'd walked through her door. I searched behind every headstone, Inspector. I am not a young woman, and the ground was uneven, and I was frightened, genuinely frightened, not for myself, but for what she might have done, whether she'd lost her nerve at the last moment and fled, or whether something worse had happened. When I found nothing, I told myself she'd simply changed her mind and gone home, too proud to face the village after all, and I went back to the Grange to wait for morning, thinking I would go to her properly, in daylight, and we would speak of it then. And you said nothing of any of this to anyone, Halloran observed, until Miss Pemberton arrived at your door and named your sister to your face. What would you have had me say, Inspector? Cordelia's chin lifted slightly, a flash of the old Thornbury pride surfacing beneath the grief. That my father's illegitimate daughter had planned to expose our family's oldest shame in the middle of the churchyard, and that I'd gone chasing after her in my night clothes to stop her. I am the last of my family's name in this village. I have spent 40 years protecting what little dignity remains to it. Old habits, Miss Pemberton, do not die simply because the situation has become a matter of blood and bells rather than gossip and whispers. It was, Agnes thought, both an honest answer and a carefully incomplete one, the sort of honesty that told the truth about everything except the one thing that mattered most. They left the Grange a little before noon, Halloran deep in thought, Peter Reeves's notebook filled with looping shorthand that Agnes suspected even he would struggle to decipher by evening. It was Agnes herself who suggested, as they passed back along the lane behind Eleanor Whitfield's shop, that they examine more closely the gap in the churchyard's hawthorn hedge, the one through which, according to the morning's footprints, a woman's shoe had apparently made her escape. The gap was narrower than Agnes had expected, barely wide enough for a slight figure to pass through sideways, the branches on either side scored with small tears in the bark where fabric had caught and pulled free in passing. Halloran crouched beside it, examining the ground with the same patient thoroughness Agnes had come to respect in him over the course of the morning. "There," he said, plucking something from a low branch with careful fingers, a thread of pale blue wool, no longer than Agnes's smallest finger, caught fast among the thorns. "Matches the shawl left in the churchyard, so she did pass through here, and recently." "Or someone wearing a garment made of the same wool," Agnes said, though even as she spoke the words she felt their thinness, the way a theory feels when it has begun, quietly, to outlive its usefulness. "But I confess, Inspector, I no longer believe that quite so readily as I did an hour ago. What's changed your mind?" Agnes was quiet a moment, looking past the gap in the hedge toward the fields beyond, where the harvest stood half-cut in long golden rows, the machinery that had been working them silent now, abandoned since the discovery in the churchyard, had drawn every able hand in the village toward gossip rather than labour. "Cordelia Thornbury's story explains a great many things," Agnes said slowly. "It explains the shawls, the family plot, the reason Eleanor might have wished to ring that bell and gather the village to bear witness to a confession 40 years overdue. But it does not explain the blood, Inspector, and I find I cannot set that detail aside so easily as Cordelia herself seems to have done in her account. A woman planning to stand before her neighbours and declare her true parentage does not typically arrive bleeding. Something happened in that churchyard between the moment Eleanor left the Grange and the moment Cordelia arrived to find it empty, something violent enough to soak a shawl through, and quick enough that whoever caused it was gone again before Cordelia herself came looking." "Someone else was there," Halloran said, following the thought to its natural conclusion. "Someone who knew Eleanor's plan, or guessed at it, and had far more reason than Cordelia Thornbury to want it silenced before it could be spoken aloud." "Which brings us," Agnes said, turning back toward the village, toward the church spire visible now above the hedgerows, to the rather uncomfortable question of who else in Thornbury Hollow stood to lose something, Inspector, if Eleanor Whitfield's parentage had become common knowledge by breakfast this morning. Because a shameful family secret once spoken cannot easily be unspoken again, and I begin to suspect that shame was not the only motive walking about this village last night. Behind them, in the field beyond the hedge, a lone figure straightened suddenly from among the standing wheat, and seeing them watching, turned and walked quickly away toward the trees. Chapter 6. The Solicitor's Silence. "Stop him," Halloran said, already moving, but the figure had vanished into the tree line before Peter Reeves had so much as cleared the gap in the hedge, and by the time the three of them had pushed through the standing wheat to the copse beyond, there was nothing to find but disturbed leaves and the fading sound of footsteps somewhere deeper in the trees. "Might have been nothing," Peter said, breathing hard, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than Agnes did. "Farmhand, perhaps. Half the village has been wandering about all morning, trying to get a look at the churchyard." "Perhaps," Agnes allowed, though she had noted, in the brief moment before the figure fled, a detail that troubled her considerably more than she cared to admit aloud, a flash of dark fabric, and beneath it, the unmistakable gleam of a gold watch chain, the sort worn by men of a certain profession, rather than farmhands chasing gossip on a summer morning. They did not find him, but Agnes carried the image of that watch chain back to the village with her, turning it over in her mind as one turns over a stone to see what lies beneath, and by the time they reached the green, she had already begun to form a suspicion she was not yet prepared to voice. "Inspector," she said, as they paused near the war memorial to let Peter catch his breath properly, "might I ask whether the Thornbury family's solicitor still practices in the district? Cordelia mentioned him, the one who drew up her father's will, the one who explained so precisely why Eleanor could never be acknowledged." "Whitcomb," Peter supplied, still slightly out of breath. "Arthur Whitcomb. Has an office in Chipping Norton, but he's out this way often enough. Handles half the estates in the valley, my mother says. Old family, old money, though rather less of the latter than there used to be, from what I hear." "And would Mr. Whitcomb," Agnes asked carefully, "have any particular reason of his own to fear what Eleanor Whitfield might say if she stood in that churchyard and declared herself a Thornbury before the whole village?" Halloran's eyes sharpened with interest. "You think the solicitor has something to lose in this?" "I think," Agnes said, "that a man who has managed a family's estate for 30 years and drawn up the very will that disinherited an illegitimate daughter might have arranged his fees, his commissions, his own quiet share of that estate's management in ways he would very much prefer not to have examined too closely, particularly not by a newly acknowledged Thornbury heir with every legal right, once recognised, to demand a full accounting of where her family's money has actually gone these past 40 years. They found Arthur Whitcomb not in Chipping Norton, as Peter had assumed, but at the Thornbury Arms in the village itself, seated alone in the small back parlour, with a glass of brandy he had clearly not touched, his usually immaculate appearance betrayed by a small tear at the shoulder of his dark coat and a scattering of what looked distinctly like wheat chaff clinging to his trouser cuffs. He did not deny, when Halloran laid the observation plainly before him, that he had been in the field beyond the churchyard that morning. "I panicked," he said, and there was something almost pitiful in the admission, the crumbling of a man who had spent decades cultivating an appearance of unshakable respectability. "When I saw you three approaching from the hedge, I simply ran. It was foolish. I see that now." "Why were you there at all, Mr. Whitcomb?" Halloran's voice had taken on the flat, patient tone Agnes recognised now as his interrogation voice, stripped of any warmth that might allow a guilty man room to relax. "Because I heard the bell, same as everyone else in the district, and because I have known for some months that Eleanor Whitfield intended to make trouble." Whitcomb's hand trembled slightly as he finally lifted the brandy glass and drank. "She came to my office in June, demanded to see her father's will in full, not merely the summary Cordelia had always shown her, demanded to know precisely how the Thornbury estate had been managed since old Reginald's death, down to the last shilling. And had it been managed honestly? Agnes asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the particular quality of Whitcomb's silence that followed. "The estate has been in decline for 30 years, he said at last, choosing his words with the visible care of a man picking his way across unstable ground. "Bad investments, poor harvests. The upkeep on a house like the Grange does not come cheaply, Miss Pemberton, and Miss Thornbury has never been one for economising where appearances are concerned. I have on occasion made certain adjustments to keep the estate solvent that a more scrupulous accounting might question. Nothing criminal, you understand, merely the ordinary flexibility any solicitor exercises in service of a family he has served faithfully for 3 decades. Merely embezzlement, dressed up in kinder language, Halloran said flatly, and Whitcomb flinched as though struck. "I never touched Eleanor Whitfield," he said, his voice rising now, urgent, frightened. "Whatever you're imagining, Inspector, I promise you I never laid a hand on that woman. I went to the churchyard last night because I was afraid of what she intended to say. Yes, afraid that if she declared herself before the whole village, the scrutiny that would follow would unravel 30 years of careful arrangements and leave me facing prison rather than simply an uncomfortable retirement. But I arrived to find the churchyard already empty, the bell already silent, and I left again within minutes, terrified and ashamed of my own cowardice. And I have been trying to compose myself ever since, wondering whether I ought to come forward or simply pray the whole business resolved itself without my involvement." "A convenient story," Halloran observed, "and one that leaves you, once again, arriving just moments too late to have seen anything useful. It is the truth, Inspector, whether or not it is convenient." Whitcomb set down his glass with a hand that had not stopped trembling, "and I will swear to it before any court in England, because it is the only truth I have to offer." Agnes, watching him carefully throughout this exchange, found herself troubled by a small, nagging detail that neither Halloran's questions nor Whitcomb's answers had yet addressed, a detail that had been sitting quietly at the edge of her thoughts since the moment they'd first examined the blood-soaked shawl in the churchyard grass. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said slowly, "when you arrived at the churchyard last night, before you found it empty, before you fled at the sight of the bell already silent, did you happen to notice whether the shawl was already lying beneath the yew tree, or whether it had not yet been placed there at all?" Whitcomb looked up at her, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not the calculation of a liar caught out, Agnes thought, but the dawning, uncertain look of a man realizing, for the first time, that he might have witnessed something significant without understanding its meaning. "Now that you mention it, Miss Pemberton," he said slowly, "I don't believe it was there at all when I arrived. I would have seen it, surely, even in the dark, that pale colour against the grass. But by the time I left, not 5 minutes later, he trailed off, his brow furrowing with the effort of memory. I couldn't say for certain. I wasn't looking at the ground on my way out. I was looking at the gate and how quickly I might reach it." Chapter 7. The Woman in the Vestry. Agnes Pemberton walked back to the churchyard alone that afternoon, leaving Halloran to the business of verifying Whitcomb's account against the ledgers his men had already begun collecting from the solicitor's office, and Peter Reeves to the rather thankless task of interviewing half the village, all of whom, it seemed, had heard the bell but seen absolutely nothing of use. She wanted, she told herself, simply to think, and there was nowhere in Thornbury Hollow better suited to thinking than the churchyard itself in the quiet hush of late afternoon, when the crowds of curious villagers had finally drifted home for their tea, and the long shadows of the yew trees stretched soft and cool across the graves. She sat on the low stone bench near the Thornbury family plot, where 3 centuries of that family's dead lay beneath weathered headstones, and turned the day's events over in her mind, the way she had once turned over a child's muddled arithmetic, searching for the single error that had led an otherwise sound calculation astray. A shawl, folded with care, arriving in the churchyard sometime between Whitcomb's departure and the moment the village began pouring into the lane. A bell rung by a woman, who then vanished entirely, leaving no trace but a footprint leading away through a gap in the hedge. A half-sister with every reason to fear exposure, and a solicitor with even more reason to fear it, both present in or near the churchyard that night, both arriving, by their own accounts, just moments too late to see anything of use. It was, Agnes thought, altogether too many people arriving just moments too late. She became aware, gradually, of a sound, faint, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the church itself rather than the graves. A soft scraping, like fabric dragged across stone, coming from the small vestry door at the church's side, which stood very slightly ajar. Agnes rose and crossed the grass without hurry, though her pulse had quickened considerably, and pushed the vestry door open. Eleanor Whitfield sat on the floor in the corner of the small room, her back against the old oak vestment cupboard, her knees drawn up beneath a plain grey dress that bore no resemblance to the pale blue shawl now sitting bagged as evidence in Inspector Halloran's temporary quarters. Her face was pale, her left arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage torn from what appeared to be a petticoat, and when she looked up at Agnes standing in the doorway, her eyes held not the guilt of a woman caught in some elaborate deception, but simple, bone-deep exhaustion. "Miss Pemberton," she said quietly, "I rather hoped it would be you who found me first." "You're hurt," Agnes said, crossing the room and crouching, with considerably more difficulty than she cared to admit, beside the younger woman. "A cut, nothing more. It bled a great deal more than the wound deserved, and I'm afraid I made rather poor use of my own shawl trying to stop it before I understood how much of it I'd need to leave behind." Eleanor's laugh was thin and humourless. "I imagine it's caused a considerable amount of trouble. The whole village believes you either murdered or missing, Miss Whitfield, and possibly both. Inspector Halloran has spent the better part of the day chasing your sister and your father's solicitor through hedgerows, trying to determine which of them might have harmed you." Agnes settled herself as comfortably as the vestry floor allowed. "I think you owe them, and this village, rather more of an explanation than a bandaged arm and a hiding place in the vestry." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers picking absently at the edge of her makeshift bandage. "I meant to do it properly," she said at last. "Ring the bell, stand in the churchyard where 300 years of Thornberrys are buried, and tell the whole village exactly who I was, who I've always been, whatever name I've carried through this life. I'd planned it for months, ever since Whitcomb showed me that will and I understood, finally, precisely how thoroughly my father had erased me. What happened? Someone was waiting for me." Eleanor's voice dropped, and for the first time, something like fear crept into it. "I don't know who. It was too dark, and they came at me from behind the yew, before I'd even finished ringing the bell. A hand over my mouth, a knife, though I don't believe they meant to use it properly. I think it was meant to frighten me, to stop me before I could speak. I fought. I got free somehow, more by luck than skill, and I ran, through the hedge, across the fields, and I've been hiding here in the vestry ever since, too frightened to go home, too frightened even to seek out Cordelia, in case whoever attacked me was watching to see where I went." "You didn't see their face at all?" "No, but I felt the watch chain, Miss Pemberton, when I struggled against them, cold metal against my wrist, the sort no farmhand or shopkeeper in this village would ever wear." Eleanor looked up, and something sharp entered her exhausted gaze. "I think whoever attacked me was a gentleman, or wished to appear one." Agnes sat with this a long moment, the pieces of the day's events rearranging themselves in her mind with the particular, satisfying click of a puzzle finally assembling itself into recognizable shape. "Arthur Whitcomb," she said slowly, "wears a gold watch chain, Miss Whitfield, and he was seen fleeing this very field not 2 hours ago, with a torn coat and considerable difficulty explaining his presence here at all." "Whitcomb." Eleanor said the name as though tasting something bitter. "Of course, he's managed my father's estate for 30 years. If I'd been acknowledged properly, if the will had ever been challenged as it ought to have been, he would have faced an accounting he could not survive," Agnes finished quietly. "Miss Whitfield, I think it's time we brought you to Inspector Halloran, before this village convinces itself of a dozen more terrible theories than the truth actually contains. And I think, moreover, that Arthur Whitcomb has rather more explaining to do than a torn coat and an unconvincing tale of cowardice." Eleanor allowed Agnes to help her to her feet, wincing slightly as she rose, and together they made their way out of the vestry into the long golden light of late afternoon, the church bell above them silent now, its brief and terrible message already delivered. But as they crossed the churchyard toward the gate, Agnes found herself troubled by one detail that refused to settle quietly into place alongside all the others. For a man fleeing in cowardly panic, as Whitcomb claimed to have done, rarely paused long enough afterward to return to the scene of his fear and wait, quite deliberately, in a wheat field, with a clear view of the very hedge through which his victim had made her escape. Chapter 8. The Truth Beneath the Wheat Sheaves. Inspector Halloran had set up his temporary quarters in the village hall, a modest room, usually reserved for the harvest fates judging tables, now cluttered instead with evidence bags, witness statements, and a large ordnance map of Thornbury Hollow pinned to the wall, marked with small red circles, indicating the church, the grange, Eleanor's shop, and the field where Whitcomb had been seen fleeing. He rose sharply when Agnes led Eleanor Whitfield through the door, his weathered face registering surprise, relief, and immediate professional focus in quick succession. "Miss Whitfield," he gestured her toward a chair with something close to gentleness. "You've caused a considerable amount of concern." "So I understand," Eleanor said, easing herself into the chair with visible discomfort, "though I promise you, Inspector, the concern was rather better placed than anyone realized. Someone tried to silence me last night and very nearly succeeded." She told her story again, more fully this time, while Peter Reeves took notes and Halloran listened without interruption, his expression growing steadily grimmer with every detail. The attack behind the yew, the watch chain, the desperate flight through the hedge. "Arthur Whitcomb," Halloran said, when she had finished, though it was less a question than a confirmation of a suspicion he had clearly been carrying since the morning. "I believe so," Eleanor said, "though I never saw his face." It was Agnes who spoke next, choosing her words with the particular care of a woman who had spent the walk from the vestry turning a stubborn piece of the puzzle over and over, searching for where it truly belonged. "Inspector, might I suggest something that has been troubling me rather more than Mr. Whitcomb's watch chain?" A man fleeing in cowardly panic, ashamed of his own weakness, as he described himself to us this morning, does not typically linger afterward at the scene of that shame. And yet we found him not fleeing the district entirely, but waiting, quite deliberately it seems, in a field with clear sight of the very hedge Miss Whitfield escaped through. I wonder whether his presence there this morning had rather less to do with panic, and rather more to do with finishing what he'd failed to finish the night before. Halloran's expression sharpened. "You think he came back to search for her?" "I think a man capable of 30 years of quiet embezzlement is rather more calculating than the frightened, ashamed figure he presented to us in the Thornbury Arms," Agnes said. "And I think, Inspector, that if you examine his coat rather more closely than you have already, you may find the tear in its shoulder tells a rather different story than the one he offered us." They found Whitcomb still at the Thornbury Arms, though considerably less composed than he had been that morning, and when Halloran's constable examined the torn shoulder of his coat under proper light, the fabric revealed threads of pale blue wool caught fast in its weave, an unmistakable match to the shawl left folded so carefully beneath the churchyard yew, and to the thread plucked earlier that day from the gap in the hawthorn hedge. Confronted with this, and with Eleanor Whitfield herself standing very much alive before him, Arthur Whitcomb's careful composure finally crumbled entirely. "I never meant to hurt her," he said, his voice breaking. "I meant only to frighten her, to make her understand what exposure would cost, not merely me, but the whole estate, every family whose affairs I've managed these past 30 years. If the truth of Reginald Thornbury's will came under proper scrutiny, Inspector, I would not have been the only man ruined by it, but she fought harder than I expected, and in the struggle, the knife—" He stopped, unable to finish. "I panicked, I fled, and when I heard, this morning, that she hadn't been found, I told myself perhaps she'd simply run off entirely, frightened enough to leave the village altogether, and I went back to that field hoping, God forgive me, that it might be true, that I might never need to answer for what I'd done." "And the shawl," Agnes asked quietly, "left so carefully folded beneath the yew?" "I folded it," Whitcomb admitted, shame thick in his voice. "After she fled, after I understood what I'd done, I couldn't simply leave it lying in the grass where anyone might trip over it in the dark before I'd had time to think. It was foolish. I see that now, folding a bloodied shawl as though tidiness could undo what had happened. But I wasn't thinking clearly, Miss Pemberton. I was thinking only of not being caught, and somehow, in that state, even a man's instincts for order don't entirely abandon him." It was, Agnes thought, a strangely human detail buried within an act of genuine cruelty. The same impulse toward neatness that had misled her, in those first cold hours in the churchyard, toward believing the scene had been deliberately staged as theatre, when in truth it had simply been the anxious tidying of a frightened, guilty man. Arthur Whitcomb was taken into custody before nightfall, and by the following morning, county investigators had descended upon his office in Chipping Norton to begin the long, careful work of untangling 30 years of quietly falsified ledgers. Cordelia Thornbury, when the full truth reached her, wept, not, Agnes suspected, for the loss of her family's remaining fortune, much of which had already been bled away by Whitcomb's careful dishonesty, but for the sister she had spent 40 years failing to properly claim, and very nearly lost entirely to a stranger's desperate silence. Eleanor Whitfield recovered slowly from her wound, though the deeper injury, the decades of quiet erasure her father's will had inflicted upon her, would take considerably longer to heal, if it ever fully did. But there was, in the weeks that followed, a small and quiet dignity restored to her. Her name entered properly, at last, into the parish records as a daughter of the Thornbury family, and a modest headstone eventually raised beside the family plot, not for her death, but simply as acknowledgement, 40 years overdue, of a life the village had always known and never quite named. As for the bell that had rung alone that Lammas Night, Agnes Pemberton often thought, in the quiet months that followed, that it had never truly rung alone at all. It had rung for every secret Thornbury Hollow kept politely folded away behind its hedgerows and its tea-trays, for every quiet injustice absorbed into the soil alongside 3 centuries of buried names. It had simply taken one woman's courage and one old schoolteacher's stubborn refusal to look away from an uncomfortable question to finally let it be heard. Agnes returned to her cottage window most evenings after that, tea in hand, watching the church tower rise dark and steady against the sunset. And though Thornbury Hollow settled, in time, back into its familiar rhythms of gossip and quiet mornings, she never again heard that bell without remembering that sometimes the truth does not creep quietly into the light. Sometimes it must be rung, loud and deliberate, until the whole world is finally forced to listen. The end. Thank you for staying with this story till the end. I hope Thornbury Hollow, Agnes and Eleanor's tale stayed with you the way a good village mystery should. See you in the next one.